Better never to have Benatar. The illusion of absolute suffering. For Bob Og, and with thanks to Ember and Sarah, who bore the incomprehensible ramblings in order that the rest of you could read something slightly less incomprehensible. Chapter 1. Introduction and Outline. Perhaps the greatest contradiction in our lives, the hardest to handle, is the knowledge there was a time when I was not alive, and there will come a time when I am not alive. On one level, when you step out of yourself and see yourself as just another human being, it makes complete sense. But on another, perhaps a deeper level, personal non-existence makes no sense at all. Douglas Orr Hofstadter, Gödel, Escher, Bach, An Eternal Golden Braid. A brief history of antinatalism. The question of whether or not it is a harm to bring a new generation into existence has been with us for a surprisingly long time, from Sophocles around 400 BC to interpretations of Buddha and the bringing about of suffering by birth, from Taoism and the aberrant nature of consciousness to Flaubert to Schopenhauer in the 19th century, from feminist arguments over the ethics and bodily autonomy of pregnancy, such as de Beauvoir in the 20th century, all the way up to postmodernist and post-postmodernist thinkers in an indifferent and material reality in which God was not merely dead, but was a dangerous fiction. It's important to point out that there is little, if anything, that these worldviews share in common, other than appearing on the Wikipedia page on antinatalism and mostly making for grim reading. It is also important to point out that, like all philosophical quandaries, the question of coming to harm by way of existence, or by way of consciousness or childbearing, etc., exist in specific historical and cultural contexts and attempt to address specific cultural and historical concerns. This historical and cultural context is important as our starting point because we are, each of us, in our own historical and cultural context now. We do not necessarily live in a pro-natalist era. Yes, many people want children and have them. Many people have children without planning to, and many more without planning particularly well. There are certainly discrete pro-natalist biases and hegemonic forces which elevate heteronormative child-producing families above the other and the childless, but nevertheless, there is a messy discursive moment happening now in which entire generations and cultures have a strained relationship with the more old-fashioned notions of making babies and having families for the sake of it. Alienation as a consequence of poverty or housing insecurity or arrested development from material causes, or anxieties about the state of the world, such as climate catastrophe or rising fascism, all play a role in the decisions, or lack of agency to make decisions, assailing an increasing cohort of people. This project has not been authored by a painfully cheerful person or misguided idealist, I assure you. Our contemporary ethics in terms of baby making should also be informed by the context of the gains made by the above antinatalists and their peers. Contraception is more normative now than it was in the early 20th century, though in the United States at least, reproductive rights are unfortunately less normative now than they were in the late 20th century, but still, we are the children of the generations who thought more deeply and liberally about whether or not they wanted kids. The purist antinatalist wings of these intellectual projects were evidently unsuccessful, given that we exist, and some of us even have children of our own, but still, this is not a new conversation. It is rather an old conversation taking place more loudly amongst more people with less grace and less research, and in the form of tweets and Tumblr posts. There is too much, and too much of it quite nuanced and elegant, for me to argue with every antinatalist position on its own merits. As I said, I am not cheerful nor idealistic, and I am a product of a culture and time with its own complex relationship to the when and how and what do we mean of procreation. I am not here to refute the feminists, nor the ground they gained in questioning assumptions about bodily autonomy, nor the Buddhists, nor Taoists in their examination of the nature of consciousness, nor Schopenhauer in his examination of free will, and I am certainly not here to argue with the branch of vegans who think humans owe it to the other species to stop fucking everything up. I am here instead to refute what I consider the most total and fully formed, hardest version of antinatalism in and of itself. The argument presented by Professor of Philosophy at the University of Cape Town and member of the editorial board of the Journal of Controversial Ideas and author of the infamous book Better Never to Have Been, David Benatar. I am here to convince you that he is wrong and he has a wrong way of going about his ethics. The Three Whoopsie Doodles of David Benatar. As we will get to, the bulk of Benatar's antinatalist position is premised on what he sees as an asymmetry between bad things and good things. It's frankly hard to start out fairly representing, lending that initial premise enough credulity and gravity to counteract what might be seen as bad faith and mockery on my part. I fully believe that it is a sincere belief on Benatar's part. He thinks the world is foundationally cruel in its distribution of the wicked and unfair and bad, and that all that could be said to be good is illusory and pointless and temporal and of negligible value. I believe that's what Benatar thinks. Perhaps you're predisposed to think this way already yourself, and you don't need me to emphasize the credulous aspects of his argument. Perhaps you're already predisposed to agree with me, and you just want to see me kick a corpse. Perhaps you haven't placed your bets yet. Regardless, I promise that as we progress through our analysis and refutation, I will try to represent his arguments honestly and, in as much as possible, in his own words and framing, with as little shorthand and miscomprehension as I can manage. In brief, for this introduction's purposes, Benatar's book, Better Never to Have Been, presents the antinatalist position as 1. The above asymmetry between good things and bad things is an objective fact, 2. That the positive features of life, although good for those who exist, cannot justify the negative features that accompany them. Their absence would not have been a deprivation for those who never came into existence. 3. That life is bad, much worse than you think. 4. And so bringing someone into existence is morally problematic. I intend to interrogate these axioms in 3 ways, which I will cheekily term the 3 whoopsie-doodles of David Benatar. 1. Cause and effect. This has massive implications for, amongst other things, the order in which non-existence and existence take place, as well as the order of events and regrets, which will in turn have massive implications for what Benatar perceives as asymmetry. It is also under this broad framework that I will tackle the non-referent problem at the heart of Benatar's position and attempt to give this rebuttal a bit more material robustness than some of his other detractors. 2. Unreliable narrator. With this framework, I will interrogate Benatar's selective oscillation between objective and subjective positions and the experiences of good and bad. I will use this section to highlight Benatar's cherry-picking and poor understanding of psych literature. I will also use insights gleaned from the earlier non-referent problem to tackle the absurdity of absolute meaning being something we lack when absolute meaninglessness is an equally absurd and unprovable condition. 3. Useless taxonomy. With this framework, I will examine Benatar's categories of good and bad, and how his taxonomical groupings serve only to reach his reverse-engineered antinatalist conclusion. Just how many things he absurdly and arbitrarily categorizes as bad, just how many of them are in the realm of the pure imaginary, and just how much complexity and nuance he sweeps aside in his quest for absolute factuality. Finally, having earned it, I will take a brief glimpse at Benatar's broader personal ideology and how that broader ideology interacts with his antinatalist worldview. Chapter 2. Cause and Effect. Benatar's Asymmetry. Benatar puts forward the idea that there is a key difference between harms and benefits. We could say immediately that there are many differences between harms and benefits and begin our backslide into messy pedantry and the twin spectra of meaning and existence, but in order to make some forward progress, let's grant the sort of difference Benatar means. One word for this difference could be a categorical difference. That's going to give us trouble when we discuss taxonomies. Another word could be objective, a can of worms of its own. For now, I'm going to use the word absolute because I think it best serves his meaning. This absolute difference is as follows. Harm and benefit are only symmetrical in the positive. Their absence has asymmetrical value. Let me illustrate this in the graphical way Benatar does. If you'll allow us to swap out harm and benefit for pain and pleasure. Scenario A, X exists. 1, presence of pain bad. 2, presence of pleasure good. Scenario B, X never exists. 3, absence of pain good. 4, absence of pleasure not bad. Notice the asymmetry? This is the absolute categorical objective difference. When one never exists, one is spared pain, and this is good. But if one never exists and never experiences pleasure, that is merely not bad or neutral. I concede that this position is really quite compelling, especially when Benatar uses the same underlying principle in relation to all good things and bad things. After all, the presence of a good thing can only be good when someone is experiencing it, whereas the absence of a bad thing is always good, and that absence is good whether it is the absence of the bad thing or the absence of the person experiencing the bad thing, right? Benatar does not see this asymmetry as arithmetic, inasmuch as he believes that there is more pain in the world than pleasure, but that no understanding of a ratio difference is necessary. We need only understand the absolute difference. This is part of his argument against the criticism we might make that his categories of good and bad involve some arbitrary value judgments. In fact, he also refutes that pleasure and pain are any manner of simple binary, saying instead that, quote, I'm using those as exemplars of the good things and the bad things in life, end quote. For example, the acquisition of knowledge takes so long and is so hard, but the loss of knowledge can take place in a tragic instance, through injury or illness, in an overdetermined relationship with chaos that is, again, of course, asymmetrical. Benatar rejects even a purely hedonic framework that reduces good and bad actions to maximizing pleasure or minimizing pain. Part of the proof of his argument, as far as he is concerned, lies in the ability to cash out his asymmetry, not just in terms of hedonic pleasure and pain, but also in terms of a desire satisfaction account or an object list account. Any good is thwarted by the sheer, overwhelming, and overdetermined amount of bad, in addition to, and because of, the absolute differences in the respective value of their absences. He accepts that it could be argued, as it is by positive utilitarians, that more happiness is good, so we do have a relative duty to make more happy people. But he argues against this perspective by saying that, quote, it is not the case that people are valuable because they add extra happiness. Instead, extra happiness is valuable because it is good for people, because it makes people's lives go better. To think otherwise is to think that people are mere means to the production of happiness. Or, to use another famous image, it is to treat persons as mere vessels of happiness. But unlike a mere vessel, which is indifferent to how much of a valued substance it contains, a person cares about how much happiness he has. End quote. Well then, seems pretty watertight. And all of that without yet going into the cheerful and illusory biases we all hold, which delude us into thinking our lives are better than they are. All of that without even getting into our pro-natalist bias, and how any and all arguments against antinatalism must be in part informed by our biological need to pass on our genes and make babies. How on earth can we argue with such a premise? Well, quite straightforwardly, actually. Suffering is an effect, which must therefore be preceded by a cause. Suffering can only be caused by existent means. Suffering can only be remedied by existent means. By not bringing someone into existence, you are neither sparing them suffering nor withholding good. Both of the states in column B of Benatar's diagram are neutral. They are both, in fact, the ultimate neutral. They are references to non-states. They are states applied to non-existent referents. Scenario A, X exists. 1. Cause leads to effect, good things happen. 2. Cause leads to effect, bad things happen. Scenario B, X never exists. 3. No cause, no effect. 4. No cause, no effect. It is not for mischief and pedantry that I invite you to think about cause and effect instead of existence and non-existence, but because cause and effect describe relationships between things and not abstract absolutes. We already set aside the many multifarious ways we could pick apart good things and bad things as categories in order to play fair with Benatar, although we shall pick up the issue of their categorization again later. For now, we are simply considering this idea of the non-existent beneficiary in terms of cause and effect, and, as a result, we do seem to have found a potential hole in the logic. This is without establishing a particular person-affecting view, such as those proposed by Arrhenius or Beckstead. The harm need not befall a human, for instance, and the value of harm or benefit need not be defined, and therefore subject to cultural or anthropocentric biases. If we propose only that suffering is an effect, which must be preceded by a cause, and we find that under such a system the absence of an experience of suffering is not equivalent to the absence of a person, then we must ask, what status, transcending cause and effect, has been conferred on Benatar's concept of suffering? Benatar attempts to plug this hole by emphasizing that he is making a counterfactual statement about a person who does exist who would have been better off not existing. His observations about suffering are based in material reality, and such suffering will be inevitable for any who come to exist. He says, quote, this objection would be mistaken because, not existing and therefore not experiencing suffering, can say something about a counterfactual case in which a person who does actually exist never did exist. Of the pain of an existing person, the absence of pain is good even if, says that the absence of this pain would have been good even if this could only have been achieved by the absence of the person who now suffers it, end quote. He admits that this, quote, clearly does not entail the absurd literal claim that there is some actual person for whom the absent pain is good, end quote. But it is in this argument we find the first of our recursive loops. There are more to come. Person P1 exists. She is in terrible anguish as a consequence of her existing. Were she to not exist, she would not be in terrible anguish, leaving aside everything else she would not be. She exists as the potential beneficiary of not existing. However, this is not to say that we, or P1 herself, are morally justified in ending her existence. We are morally justified in making it so she never existed. This is, unfortunately, impossible, as existing is an effect of coming to exist, which is a cause. Cause always precedes effect. Person P2 does not exist. If we were to bring about their existence, it would have no impact on person P1. To get around this causal issue, Benatar superimposes two states: a subjective position, the perspective and benefit of a person who exists, and an objective position, the abstract suffering of a person who does not exist. And then one oscillates between those perspectives as if they are in relation to the same subject, and two places the burden of absurdity on his detractor when the question is of benefit rather than of harm. Benatar is quite happy to illustrate this absurdity, the tendency to confuse an existent being with a non-existent being, when this is done in reference to positive experiences. When the argument is made that people are generally glad that they exist, Benatar argues, aside from this being an illusion, that we are confusing cessation of existence with never existing. The burden of absurdity of non-existence is placed on those arguing the case for existence. It happens again in the argument he makes against positive utilitarians, as in the quote above, where he points out that the only real good things are things that happen to people who exist. But what happens if we repeat that quote and trade out happiness for suffering? Like this. Extra suffering is bad because it is bad for people, because it makes people's lives go worse. To think otherwise is to think that people are mere means to the production of suffering, or it is to treat persons as mere vessels of suffering. But unlike a mere vessel, which is indifferent to how much of a valued substance it contains, a person cares about how much suffering he has. In his debate with Jordan Peterson, as Neil Innes once said, "I suffered for my art and now it's your turn," JBP makes an appeal to love. He points out that in loving, we actively demonstrate that we find it better to be, and we find it better that someone else is, in spite of all faults and suffering. Benatar makes the argument, again, that this is a confusion between cessation of existence and never existing. We only love those who exist, and the kindest act to any potential person who might exist is to not bring them into existence. This reveals the circularity of the argument. He says, quite directly, quote, "But I think it's indecent to suggest you would bring into existence a being that would then have to face these challenges when there's absolutely no reason from that being's point of view why you should bring it into existence in the first place." End quote. But I could ask, what point of view, Mr. Benatar? The point of view of a person who truly, in the sense of its meaning, does not exist? I have a joke about this. A man who does not exist called me up the other day. He said to stop making shit up about him. The 13 Reasons Why Fallacy. It is at this point that we return to the quote at the very top, by legendary polymath Douglas Hofstadter from his magnum opus Gödel, Escher, Bach, An Eternal Golden Braid. Quote, "Perhaps the greatest contradiction in our lives, the hardest to handle, is the knowledge there was a time when I was not alive, and there will come a time when I am not alive. On one level, when you step out of yourself and see yourself as just another human being, it makes complete sense. But on another level, perhaps a deeper level, personal non-existence makes no sense at all." End quote. The concept of non-existence deserves far more attention than Benatar's work gives it. The details of identity over the course of our lives and this bleak conundrum of death are interrogated in one of the texts to which Benatar is replying, Reasons and Persons by Derek Parfit, in which the rational and ethical conclusion is to grapple with the dissolution of the individual and the responsibilities of collectivism. But over the course of Better Never to Have Been, far more intellectual real estate is set aside for the inconvenience of having detractors and naysayers to reply to, and all of their many biases and shortcomings, than is given to something so central as the nature of existence and non-existence. not that much can be said of non-existence. That which can be said is composed of its own koans and circularity and mystery. This is something Douglas Hofstadter knew well when he sat down to write Gödel-Escherbach, a book about Gödel's incompleteness theorem, strange loops, and the nature of reality, all of it innately relying on self-reference and recurrence in order to be. I believe that there is an innate contradiction in proposing any discrete non-existence. This may seem uncontroversial, but as we will see, it has far-reaching implications. We can talk about non-existence as it relates to existence in the abstract. After all, that's the most provable and consistent version of the concept of non-existence we could propose, that which is in absentia outside of existence. But when we apply this to discrete non-existences, we could recognize that there is a logical problem. To put it simply, there is no such thing as anyone who has ever not existed. Therefore, the absence of their suffering is a non-statement. And this isn't to be silly or quibble. If you want to talk about people who don't exist in material reality, we can. We can talk about the suffering of Chief Miles O'Brien or the pleasure of Dionysus. But for our purposes, those might as well be discrete existences. That is, those are people who have fictional existences. They don't really experience suffering or pleasure, and they don't really not exist in the sense that we can refer to them. If we apply this idea of discrete existence and discrete non-existence to, say, the absence of a person whose would-be parents decided not to conceive them upon reading David Benatar's book, then you can see that though they might be said to exist in a fashion similar to fiction, still their would-be suffering is no more real than their would-be pleasure. The state of non-existence is total, that is, when we don't obfuscate and oscillate between Benatar's subjectivity and objectivity. The idea of somehow benefiting from non-existence only makes sense as a narrative illusion. This is a common trope amongst those experiencing suicidal ideation and those who commit suicide. I've decided to name my view of the fallacy a little grimly the 13 Reasons Why fallacy, after the Netflix show in which a victim of suicide has recorded a set of cassette tapes detailing the reasons why she did it, and those who she believes were responsible for her immiseration. The idea of your death being cathartic, a harsh and grim lesson for the world, as well as the illusion that you somehow can narrate and bear witness to these lessons is tempting, but clearly only something that can be accomplished in fiction. The show received a great deal of criticism for its irresponsible depiction of suicide, and caused a spike in suicides amongst young people. I believe that from an ethical position, promoting the 13 Reasons Why fallacy is dangerous and morally problematic, and I have chosen to link Benatar's work quite knowingly. However poetic it may seem, the idea of a beneficiary of a suffering-free non-existence is as absurd as the idea of a post-death narrator in 13 Reasons Why. In challenging Benatar's worldview, David Spurrett of the University of KwaZulu-Natal asks if Benatar's diagram demonstrating asymmetry is truly exhaustive. That is, if it is factoring in the good and bad of existence, does it leave anything out? As Spurrett says, quote, if we accept the premise that an individual life is valuable, along with the claims that the presence of value is good and its absence is bad, then we might revise Benatar's table as follows, end quote. Scenario A, X exists. Presence of pain, bad. Presence of pleasure, good. Presence of a valuable human life, good. Scenario B, X never exists. Absence of pain, good. Absence of pleasure, not bad. Absence of a valuable human life, bad. By adding this third row, Spurrett has made the diagram more meaningful, that is, a more robust assessment of a more robust system. Benatar himself admits that people are not mere vessels for enjoyment. We can presume that it is also true that we are not mere vessels for suffering, and we can assume, as Spurrett does, that joy and suffering are not entities. People are entities. Most importantly, the value of a human life is more robustly and responsibly described in this system in a way that matches our intuition, such that our intuition need not be dismissed as illusory or overly cheerful. It might be the case that this position is neither cheerful nor miserable, but simply self-consistent. The philosopher Christian Pillar describes Benatar's position as, quote, philosophically flawed, and one of the central pillars underlying this claim is that Benatar's diagram does not allow for full comparability. He argues that, quote, when the alternatives themselves affect how standards apply to them, questions of comparisons become ambiguous, end quote. This could be thought of in terms of the unconditional applicability of regret. Because we exist in the state of events that did happen, we don't know how things would have worked out had a different state of events happened. Thus, we can always regret what we did. Pitter playfully invokes Kierkegaard's famous quote about marriage. Quote, "Marry and you will regret it. Don't marry, you will also regret it. Marry or don't marry, you will regret it either way." End quote. This is not, as a pessimist might argue, to say that regret is overdetermined, rather that regret itself is an emotional experience positioned irrationally towards causality. Pitter argues that we need a here and a there for true comparison, by which he would seem to mean comparison that is meaningful and informative, that is, what we might think of as scientific, empirical, etc. But what do we mean by a here and a there? If we return to Kierkegaard's famous aphorism, we could say that true comparison would have to involve two persons, as similar as possible in terms of disposition, identity, age, class, etc., one of whom marries and the other does not. Then, although there would still be many ambiguities and a lot of room for false deductions, there would at least be comparison. We could measure married person 1 in terms of their envy and pity for unmarried person 2, but crucially, we could also measure unmarried person 2 in their envy and their pity for married person 1. We think of such direct comparisons as being one of the only ways in which true material observations can be made. We have control groups for a reason. But Benatar only has a here, the exister. Statements of illusory joy, of absolute suffering, and regret, which is not framed as illusory, can be made about the exister, but the non-exister is viewed by inference. They are referred to counterfactually. Moreover, the good that is done to them, or for them, is rendered as absurd when framed as a benefit, and as absolute and real when framed as a spared harm. This could all be explained by Piller's conception of comparison itself. Benatar has no control group. He simply takes the experience of the unhappy married person 1 and agrees that marriage is awful. The way he approaches data is to assemble a committee of such unhappy married persons and to dismiss those happy married persons as mistaken. Time. Another way to think about all of this is that time is linear. It moves forward in a single direction, and we cannot transfer benefits or harms in a backwards direction relative to time's arrow. In the above diagram, the forward progression of time into the future is rendered in black, and the backwards progression into the past is grayed out. Grey, in this case, means impossible. This applies to benefits that one might confer on one's younger self, harms that one might do to one's younger self, or harms or benefits that could be done to anyone at any point in time earlier than the present. The benefits and harms are also non-transferable between person 1 and person 2 in a backwards direction in time. The sudden cessation of existence of person 1, or her winning the lottery or so forth, cannot benefit the infant person 2 30 years earlier. This is still essentially a presentation of cause and effect, albeit in different terms. What we can do is generate a cause in the present which may have an immediate effect or an effect in the future, but what we cannot do is generate a cause in the present which has any effect on events that have already happened. Effect can never precede cause. So we could say that the premise of Benatar's book, if the title is taken literally, cannot be acted upon. Better never to have been requires the transferring of a never being backwards through time in order to confer a better. Provided, that is, we are talking about discrete existences, that is, the existence of specific individuals whose coming to be has caused them insurmountable harm. As we have discussed, truly non-existent folk, those who are non-existent in a meaningful and consistent sense, already don't have harms or benefits. They equally do not have potential harms or benefits, so therefore no mercies or losses. Fictional existences, although considerably different to real existences, make up their own subcategory. They exist in our imaginations. As long as that is where they exist, as long as they are fictional, they cannot be harmed, nor benefited, nor spared harm, nor withheld from benefit, only narratively conceived of as having a relationship to fictional harms, fictional benefits, fictional mercies, etc. It is in this, perhaps obvious, insight that we find a useful distinction between an ontology of relationships and an ontology of abstract absolutes. If harm or benefit had their absolute value supersede their each being made of relationships between things, then perhaps fictional harm and benefit would be a moral consideration. In such a world, we might have a moral imperative to write on a piece of paper an infinite number of people named Sheila were all happily eating some chocolate over and over so as to perform some best-case utilitarian moral action. But thankfully, this is not the world, and the distinction between fictional benefit and real benefit, that which is a relationship between things, remains useful. It is in this category of fictional that I place, somewhat imperfectly, planned potential offspring. As long as they are only dreamed of, they cannot be harmed nor benefited, but they also cannot be withheld from benefit nor spared harm. And in the case of planned folk, their fictional existence precedes their real existence, just as cause precedes effect. This is important. While existing only in the realm of the imaginary, such a being does not exist in the real. So while dreaming and planning, parents and others may use this powerful tool of imagination to create material conditions in which a child's existence will hopefully be as good and safe and free of suffering as possible. They can read parenting books and save money and buy a cot and so forth. But until such a child comes to exist, that child's own discrete experience of suffering is a non-state. And because their suffering is only imaginary, then deciding not to bring them into existence does nothing to reduce either 1, the total amount of suffering in the world, or 2, the subjective discrete suffering of any being that exists. If we are to place value in the prevention of fictional suffering of any imaginary being, then, again, we should be writing of infinite Sheilas in their infinite joy. This is why Benatar oscillates between the model of abstract overall human suffering and the benefit from that being's point of view model of suffering in order to maintain the originating conclusion from which he worked backwards, that it is better never to have been. As soon as we consider suffering as only ever being a discrete relationship between causes, effects, and subjects, then suddenly the usefulness of Benatar's preventative measure falls apart. As I have said, he would argue that we can infer from the suffering of those who do exist the overdetermined suffering of those who will come to exist, so we will have to deal with a more robust interrogation of this version of the argument later. In Chapter 3, we will interrogate the means by which Benatar finds evidence of suffering, and in Chapter 4, and to a lesser extent in Chapter 5, we will examine the means by which various of our experiences are compartmented into suffering and not suffering. For now, under the lens of this chapter's whoopsie-doodle, this whole idea of better never to have been contains something of a recursive contradiction, at least when taken literally. It breaks the rule of cause and effect. In order for something to be better, it must be. In order for someone to benefit or suffer at all, in any discrete and meaningful sense, they must exist. The alternative non-existent beneficiary falls afoul of the 13 Reasons Why fallacy, the idea that a non-existent being could benefit from anything in any meaningful or non-fictional sense. Better not do this again would at least be advice that follows the rules of cause and effect, even if it would be just as impossible to implement. To reiterate, with the added context of linear time, suffering is an effect, which must therefore be preceded by a cause. Suffering can only be caused by existent means. Suffering can only be remedied by existent means. The reply to this might be, well then coming to exist, being born, is a cause of suffering, and suffering is the effect of being born. Or simply take the earlier diagram and place the causal event of suffering at the earliest originating point. Granted that coming to exist is a continuum of events rather than one discrete event of being born, still we place the causal event as early as possible for argument's sake. Given the above diagram, which is a good faith effort to render the system as Benatar describes it, there's certainly no great difficulty finding the point at which one might intervene to prevent harm. By preventing existence, we could prevent harm, right? But what if I were to ask you simply, who benefits? Under a system of discrete suffering, in which suffering is an effect, a relationship between existing things, who benefits? If you were to point to person 1, you might see a problem. Person 1 would be truly non-existent if their existence were prevented. They would remain either a fiction, planned, or a never even dreamed of referent. In either case, they have not avoided suffering, because there is no them. Again, this is one of the key differences between an ontology of relationships and an ontology of absolutes. But as we will see, an ontology of absolutes carries far more problems than just that. It inevitably requires arbitrary categorization. The categories of bad things and good things, for example. Whereas an ontology of relationships is self-describing. Bad things exist in relation to good things. We don't need to list them. An ontology of relationships, at least in those instances where it is applied to human concerns, demands a subject, in a discrete moment, in a relationship between cause and effect. This is not limited to humans, nor to snapshots in time, but it does fall back on the useful descriptiveness of relationships between things, as well as the consistently true axiom that cause precedes effect. As much as Benatar is compelled by the idea that suffering is some abstract absolute that can and must be avoided, even at the cost of no one having a relationship to that benefit, he'll come right back down to earth and relativism if it's in service of undermining our relationship to good things. This is not to say that Benatar has some definitive bias towards the realness of suffering and misery, which is betrayed by his scoffing at the relativism of joy. At least we don't need to make that argument yet. But rather, this seems to be an issue with an ontology of absolutes in itself. An ontology of absolutes must necessarily exist outside of time, outside of cause and effect, and concern itself with these grand objective values of good and bad and meaning and non-meaning and so forth, which are considered as these ontological entities rather than modes of categorization or, even better, relationships. I can clarify here that I am drawing a distinction between, on the one side, metaphysics or philosophy of meaning that takes some value or other as essential or absolute, and on the other side, metaphysics or philosophy of meaning that concerns itself only with describing the relationships between things. The former way of proceeding is subject to bias by way of categorization. What do we take as absolute, and from what absolute position do we adjudicate its absoluteness? The potential bias is clear when we see Benatar dismiss the good of our lives as an ephemeral and unreliable fluke of subjectivity, whereas the bad in our lives he views as, David Wasserman puts it, from the point of view of the universe. Benatar plays fast and loose with this oscillation between the universal viewpoint and the human viewpoint when he talks about regret and decisions that are regrettable. Regrettable decisions are, by their nature, decisions which can be viewed in hindsight, after both cause and effect, as having done some harm. When Benatar uses as proof of his axiological asymmetry that bringing someone into existence can be regrettable for that person, and that the bad things that happen to them can be regretted, he is dispensing with subjectivity as a structural flaw, and disregarding the absurd notion that all the good that happens to them could be a benefit from the point of view of the universe. A non-existent person certainly cannot regret, because there is nothing to regret, and no regretter either. However, this actually undermines the asymmetry, because this is not good. It is, of course, not bad. It is neutral. Time's arrow, cause and effect, enter into Benatar's worldview quite selectively, in order to seize the tool of regret. But regret is an effect which must be preceded by a cause. The non-referent problem all over again. For now, let's set aside these cause and effect loops and problems of comparison. Let us instead focus on this oscillation between subjective and objective perspectives. Chapter 3. Unreliable Narrator. Subjectivity. Because of ethics committees in the real world of academia, because of the nature of self-reporting, because of the limits of interrogating one's inner workings, we can really only measure people's relationship to suffering. We can't satisfyingly measure the experience of the suffering itself. We can't reduce the concept of suffering to an indivisible atom or Planck length of pain. Similarly, we can only measure people's relationship to pleasure, future pleasure, or the idea of pleasure, or how they report experiencing transitory pleasure, or transitory good, or long-term satisfaction, etc. No Planck length of pleasure either. Self-reporting is notoriously tricky to interact with. The field of psychology, especially when taken as a big tent, has a wild and varied history of both the best of hard science and the truly unscientific, of the ethically courageous and the unambiguously evil, of both emancipation and hierarchical reinforcement. Before we get too swept up in the next section, I am marking the need for causation and relativism not just in terms of the problem of human suffering, but also in terms of the tools with which we measure it. In Chapter 3 of Better Never to Have Been, Benatar moves on from his axiomatic proof of the asymmetry of suffering towards a more pragmatic interrogation of how bad our lives are and how bad we are at knowing it. He says, quote, "I have argued that so long as life contains even the smallest quantity of bad, coming into existence is a harm. Whether or not one accepts this conclusion, one can recognize that a life containing a significant amount of bad is a harm. I turn now to show that all human lives contain more bad than is ordinarily recognized." End quote. Again, I find this quite compelling on the face of it. It makes intuitive sense, a kind of sense which is borne out in our a posteriori experiences. Life is full of suffering, and a great deal of suffering at that. Benatar goes on, detailing not just the uncountable list of bad things, but also the particular biases we have that blind us to our suffering. However, before I outline an attempt to challenge these lists, I can't help my logical hangover from the previous chapter. If we are to ask of this immeasurable suffering, as Frederick Jameson asks of literary realism, as opposed to what, we would presumably get Benatar's go-to answer, never being. Now, apart from the causal issue of implementing non-existence backwards in time when all of us already exist in the present, and I mean all of us, as I said, there is no such thing as anyone who doesn't exist, there's also an as opposed to what issue in terms of the experience of suffering. That is to say, if we are mistaken about how good our lives are, what is the actual good that Benatar is referring to, and from where is it derived? Or to put it in terms of suffering, if the category of suffering belongs to some objective absolute essence which exists outside of our experience of suffering, then by what means is it distinguished from its apparently illusory counterpart in joy? In the accompanying video on this subject, I use the analogy of a slider bar. This admittedly imposes some nature and limits on the concepts of suffering and joy. It presumes some spectral nature to the whole business. But if we see it through, just as we might adjust the brightness setting on our phone or laptop from fully dark to fully bright, we might measure human experiences on the slider bar marked at one end miserable and at the other end lovely. This is never going to be true of every discrete mode of suffering and joy, but it is also not sufficiently untrue of a comprehensive list of joys and miseries that might rival Benatar's own. When, as the antinatalist supporters of Benatar insist, we disregard the absurdity of conferring a benefit on a non-existent person, and instead only regard it as avoiding a harm, we suffer something of a pedantic breakdown. We're simply not allowed to think of avoiding a harm as a benefit. The slider bar must be two slider bars, one marked benefit and one marked harm, and furthermore, our entire ontological system must contort to maintain the distinction. As we progress through Benatar's examination of psychology, self-reporting, value systems, and meaning, we will see that his distinction between illusory good and absolute bad can only be maintained through an oscillation between subjective and objective positions. Starting from the belief that bad exists as an absolute essence, but that good exists only inasmuch as it is experienced by people, and that good is illusory, whereas bad is real, Benatar is eventually forced to tread a very precarious line with the science on the subject. The data he cites is very selective, sometimes outdated, and where the field of psychology is engaged in a conversation about norms and the usefulness of coping strategies, Benatar is insistent on absolute illusion, more than once directly contradicting his sources. He emphasizes, and sometimes misrepresents, the biases that stem from cheerfulness, but wholly ignores the biases that stem from depression, sometimes even falsely crediting a depressive outlook as correct, and so on. In short, Benatar puts forward the position that we are mistaken about how bad our lives actually are, without putting forward the equally relevant position that we are also mistaken about how good our lives actually are. He also lends no credence to cultural difference or to any relative value system. This will become more relevant in chapters 4 and 5, but for now, I ask only for an open mind in considering both meaning and meaninglessness as relativistic, both good things and bad things as causal and subjective, and both suffering and joy as potentially illusory. If we hold on to the idea that an ontology of relationships is more consistent and well-formed than an ontology of absolutes, then we can hear Benatar tell us we are mistaken about many of the things in our lives and believe him and get some use of it. But equally, we will be armed with the knowledge that we are not only mistaken when we disagree with him, and that he may in fact be mistaken or misguided in terms of what suffering even is. The Pollyanna Principle. Benatar seems to be sure that there is a life of misery disguised by a theatre of illusory joy. When presented with the argument that people seem to quite enjoy their lives and are, if not ecstatic, generally pretty happy, he says, quote, "There is very good reason to doubt that these self-assessments are a reliable indicator of a life's quality. There are a number of well-known features of human psychology that can account for the favorable assessment people usually make of their own life's quality. It is these psychological phenomena, rather than the actual quality of a life, that explain the extent of the positive assessment," end quote. There's really only one feature of human psychology that Benatar gets his teeth into in order to support this view. There is some gesturing towards other phenomena, but as you'll come to see, they all essentially amount to the same thing, the illusion of happiness or habituation to torment. More importantly, there are innumerable features of human psychology that don't make the final cut of Better Never to Have Been because they either muddy or contradict this central premise. Let's examine the argument as he presents it. He introduces us to his primary foundation of illusion from the world of psychology, the Pollyanna principle. This is a tendency to remember pleasant things more accurately than unpleasant things. As Benatar elaborates, quote, "This selective recall distorts our judgment of how well our lives have gone so far. It is not only assessments of our past that are biased, but also our projections or expectations about the future. We tend to have an exaggerated view of how good things will be," end quote. This is pretty accurately put as a standalone summary. The sources that Benatar cites certainly agree with him that we tend to put a positive spin not just on past events, but on future projections in many cases. Note the qualifiers tend and in many cases. However, citing the sources he does in order to support the idea that there is in any way a real mode of suffering operating in the background of our lives is something of a disservice to at least some of these original works. In Illusion and Well-Being, a social psychological perspective on mental health, the authors put forward the idea that, quote, "Considerable research evidence suggests that overly positive self-evaluations, exaggerated perceptions of control or mastery, and unrealistic optimism are characteristic of normal human thought. Moreover, these illusions appear to promote other criteria of mental health, including the ability to care about others, the ability to be happy or contented, and the ability to engage in productive and creative work," end quote. Another source, Positive Illusions, Creative Self-Deception, and the Healthy Mind, is essentially premised on the idea that creative self-deception is one of the ways in which we can have a, quote, "healthy mind." At least some of the authors cited have a body of work that challenges the idea that accurate self-assessment is either 1. An indicator of good mental health, or 2. The path to good mental health. In short, though we may be deceived, that self-deception may be good for us, good for others, and good for the world. But it is when Benatar makes the claim that, quote, "those with a more realistic view tend either to be depressed or have low self-esteem or both," end quote, that we run into trouble, and where a body of robust supporting work on the complexity of human psychology is more profoundly absent. In The Inevitability of Future Suffering, the role of depressive predictive certainty in depression, 2 studies were conducted to show that depressed individuals make more pessimistic predictions about the future and do so with more certainty, but not with any more accuracy. According to Wensloff and Grozier in Depression and a Magnification of Failure, quote, "Depressed individuals minimize the importance of successes while magnifying the significance of failures," end quote. So is it that cheerfulness, not misery, holds the real power of clairvoyance? Of course not. From a social psychology perspective, neither bias should be considered as anything other than a deviation from a norm, which in turn only exists to make helpful evaluations for individuals and groups navigating their own mental health. That is, depression is not a superpower, and cheerfulness is not an illness. Both exist as a relationship to an as opposed to what, which in this case is a quite boring, kinda happy norm, which allows us to navigate life's ups and downs. Even if that norm occasionally stands in the way of pure perception, that is because we evolved to perceive things that way, in the same way that we cannot see ultraviolet light because we are not bees. This norm is useful. This is a foundation from which we can make observations that are useful and can be acted upon, as in the case of mental health practices. In the next section, we will tackle the useless taxonomy of absolute miseries and meaninglessnesses, and pointlessly equivalent complaints that Benatar proposes we use instead, taxonomies that would encourage us to go extinct. But for now, I wish to address the other features of human psychology that Benatar lists, given that now we are comparing them to normative human mood, as opposed to comparing them to pure perception or absolute hell or whatever. As I indicated earlier, the Pollyanna principle is over-relied upon throughout the book and slightly bent out of shape to fit Benatar's purposes, but in coordination with that principle he also brings up 2 ideas. The first we shall term, as he does, habituation. As he describes it, quote, "When a person's objective well-being takes a turn for the worse, there is, at first, a significant subjective dissatisfaction. However, there is a tendency then to adapt to the new situation and to adjust one's expectations accordingly," end quote. The cluster of phenomena he's referring to is certainly backed up by literature, and it's important to point out the same thing tends to happen in the case of very positive events. It is well known in layman's spheres that even multi-million lottery jackpot winners will tend to return to their normative mood after a period of time. I could admit to some disappointment that my normative mood might be largely inescapable, as much as that might be easily spun as liberating. But there's a key element that Benatar leaves out. The whole idea of antidepressants, for example, is that mood can be modulated through medicine if it is causing someone to suffer. Remember suffering? I think we were supposed to be doing something about suffering. By altering brain chemistry, by inhibiting the reuptake of serotonin or norepinephrine, for instance, a general low mood can be elevated to a more normative state of kinda happy. We can't, and we probably shouldn't, make people into smiling, laughing gobshites all the livelong day, but we have both the understanding and the technology to prevent suffering, not just in the form of depression, but in other distressing deviations from the norm, such as chronic anxiety. Now, mad pride advocates can make the argument that manufacturing such a norm impinges on freedom, and that many people are only perceived as ill because of our normative society. And that can in itself be a fruitful world of inquiry, debate, and collaboration. The social construction argument is one we will return to, but for now, it is not the argument that Benatar is making. Benatar is making the argument that by returning to a norm, we are alienated from the truth of our misery. But if we are not comparing to a norm, what are we comparing to? I can put up my hand here and admit that I am a fan of both Judith Butler and Michel Foucault, so I hold the view that society is illusions and social constructs all the way down. But much like the absurdity of non-existence, such a framing of mood or of mental health is unhelpful in its having no referent, no alternative, other than never existing in the first place. So habituation, to me, rather than being a problem, is more like body temperature. I need to return to normal in order to function, but occasionally jumping in the sauna or the cold ocean is good for me also. The final feature of human psychology that Benatar gestures towards is that of comparison. Quote, "It is not so much how well one's life goes, as how well it goes in comparison with others that determines one's judgment about how well one's life is going," end quote. To me, this is a very pointed example of Benatar's hostility to constructed value systems. When we reach chapter 5 and I am singing the praises of constructed meaning and the creative act of value systems, I will be the furthest from Benatar's perspective on life that I think it is possible to be. Yes, we do compare our lives to others. This is an as opposed to what that Benatar presents himself, but it is presented as a problem in objective assessment. Why? Because, as he writes, quote, "One effect of this is that those negative features of life that are shared by everybody are inert in people's judgment about their own well-being. Since these features are very relevant, overlooking them leads to unreliable judgments," end quote. I can go no further in my refutation of this perspective without once again invoking the fundamental issue with an ontology of absolutes. I propose an ontology of relationships, and so the act of comparison must have a referent to compare to. The problem for Benatar is that the constructed lives we live and the coping strategies of our own minds hold us back from seeing the real or absolute misery that for him exists beyond the construct. At a certain point, this deviation of value becomes, at least according to my knowingly constructed value system, a matter of taste, and perhaps even a reflection of baseline mood and disposition. I cannot allow space for the relativism of value systems that I will come to celebrate in chapter 5 without allowing space for Benatar's value system here and now. So, given that each of us is, at least according to me, our own particular shape of unreliable narrator, let us turn our attention to the meaning of life. The meaning of life. Quote, "To suggest that our rejoicings and sorrowings rest upon illusion, out of deference to metaphysical requirements, would seem to rob our lives of all meaning." End quote. Richard Taylor. You might say that by invoking pragmatic relationships like useful psychological norm or baseline mood, I am guilty of my own arbitrary value judgments, where those things matter in a way that is superior to Benatar's concerns over real and absolute suffering. By dismissing his interrogation, I could easily throw out the philosophy of ethics baby with the Benatar bathwater. That is, while Benatar is clearly not a psychologist, it need not be verboten that he use features of human psychology to bolster the lived-in features of his asymmetry, and, moreover, that as an ethicist, he is within his rights to ask questions of absolute value. So I propose that you and I and Benatar meet atop the hill of absolute meaning, where we'll find poor old Sisyphus pushing his rock. After all, it is in this thought experiment, and specifically Taylor's modification of it, that we find the hardest version of Benatar's unknowability, and perhaps unsurprisingly, further reason for despair. Quick recap for the hell of it, and for those unfamiliar with the myth of Sisyphus who have unaccountably read this far. Sisyphus is a character from Greek mythology who angered the gods, specifically Zeus. A wicked king, he broke the law of hospitality that was seen as sacred at the time by killing guests when honor-bound to host them. This was the ancient law of Xenia, over which Zeus himself had dominion. Not only that, but when Zeus ordered Thanatos, the personification of death, to chain Sisyphus up in Tartarus, Sisyphus tricked Thanatos into being chained up himself, and so for a while death could not take place. In some versions of the story, it's Hades who gets chained up, but still, no death. What follows is the infamous eternal damnation of Sisyphus, a point of endless, perhaps pointless, fascination for philosophers and artists and thinkers. Sisyphus is forced to push a boulder up a steep hill at Tartarus, a boulder that is enchanted to roll away down the hill as soon as Sisyphus nears the summit. The task is intended to be miserable and pointless in its misery and miserable in its pointlessness. We imagine that Sisyphus must push and groan, and just as he nears completion of his task, it starts over. This forms a strong metaphor for the thankless labor of humans, for the housewife doing dishes, for the factory worker assembling parts, even for the metabolizing organisms in their iterative generations of life and death, or if you like, for the philosopher in their fruitless search for meaning. Many philosophers have played with the conditions of Sisyphus's damnation in order to glean something of the limits and nature of meaning and meaninglessness. One in particular, the American philosopher Richard Taylor, proposed a modification which caught the interest of David Benatar, and to which we will now turn our attention. Quote, "Let us suppose that the gods, while condemning Sisyphus to the fate just described, at the same time as an afterthought, waxed perversely merciful by implanting in him a strange and irrational impulse, namely, a compulsive impulse to roll stones. We may, if we like, to make this more graphic, suppose they accomplish this by implanting in him some substance that has this effect on his character and drives. I call this perverse because from our point of view there is clearly no reason why anyone should have a persistent and insatiable desire to do something so pointless as that. Nevertheless, suppose that is Sisyphus's condition. He has but one obsession, which is to roll stones, and it is an obsession that is only for the moment appeased by his rolling them. He no sooner gets a stone rolled to the top of the hill than he is restless to roll up another. Now, it can be seen why this little afterthought of the gods, which I called perverse, was also in fact merciful, for they have by this device managed to give Sisyphus precisely what he wants, by making him precisely what they inflict on him. However it may appear to us, Sisyphus's fate now does not appear to him as a condemnation, but the very reverse. His one desire in life is to roll stones, and he is absolutely guaranteed its endless fulfillment. Where otherwise he might profoundly have wished surcease, or even welcomed the quiet of death to release him from endless boredom and meaninglessness, his life is now filled with mission and meaning, and he seems to himself to have been given an entry to heaven. Nor need he even fear death, for the gods have promised him an endless opportunity to indulge his single purpose, without concern or frustration. He will be able to roll stones forever." End quote. According to David Benatar, it is in Taylor's modification that we see another great tragedy and asymmetry, our inability to distinguish meaning from illusion. The pointless, or potentially pointless, bears a great deal more weight than the arbitrarily meaningful. Our lives are as cursed as the damnation of Sisyphus, and we are doomed to know only the subjective illusion of our petty pursuits, like fools pushing rocks up hills. But I wish to propose that this is another of Benatar's manufactured problems that stems from the pursuit of absolutes and, essentially, a subjective rejection of the value of relativism. In the absence of an as opposed to what, there is no distinction between the illusion of meaning and meaning that is, on some higher order of things, real. This is a feature of any ontology of absolutes, whether that's some deontology from which we receive absolute rules, or Benatar's adjusted nihilistic materialism in which everything exists in tragic absence from absolute meaning. Holding as opposed to what as a core value, however, there would appear to be no distinction between absolute meaninglessness and the illusion of absolute meaninglessness. That is, any declaration of absolute meaninglessness requires conditions that would define this absoluteness in opposition to mere illusion of absolute meaninglessness. From where does the proof of the poison in our blood stem, and from which position of adjudication is its inherent tragedy proposed? The normal common, sane reaction to pushing the rock up the hill could be thought of as the one in which Sisyphus enjoys it, and the illusion could be that it is meaningless or bad, for any number of reasons, not least of which that it requires an external objective observer to know or guess that there is a drug in Sisyphus's veins. It is by placing Sisyphus in relation to material or descriptive alternatives that we see the creative value system at play in interpreting the myth. There is no absolute interpretation of Sisyphus's condition, no more for him than for us. So, when Benatar compares Sisyphus's condition to nothing, he is arguably repeating the mistake that Christian Pillar points to when he compares the miseries of existing with nothing. When we imagine Sisyphus, it is more informative to imagine a particular Sisyphus as opposed to another, and we should recognize that this is the only way to glean any information from the whole puzzle. We cannot describe absolutes without referent. We can only muddy our meaning in terms of an implied alternative. We limit ourselves to arbitrarily inferring or choosing not to strictly determine the opposing set of conditions that we mean, and that pushes us further from objectivity by way of unknown variables in our subjective values. If a thought experiment is constructed for argument's sake to be the exemplar of absolute meaninglessness, or of absolute meaning, then it is important to remember that the conditions of such a thought experiment are, as opposed to, all of the small discrete units of meaning that would exist if Sisyphus were in the real world. His eventual death, the size of the stone, the people he meets on his journey, the music he makes of the rock, the beauty he sees in the hill, the temple he builds at its summit, and so on. To quote Taylor again, and this time allowing him his own intended meaning, quote, "At this point then we can reintroduce what has been until now, it is hoped, resolutely pushed aside in an effort to view our lives and human existence with objectivity. Namely, our own wills, our deep interest in what we find ourselves doing. If we do this, we find that our lives do indeed still resemble that of Sisyphus, but that the meaningfulness they thus lack is precisely the meaningfulness of infinite boredom. At the same time, the strange meaningfulness they possess is that of the inner compulsion to be doing just what they were put here to do, and to go on doing it forever. This is the nearest we may hope to get to heaven, but the redeeming side of that fact is that we do thereby avoid a genuine hell." End quote. Sacredness. Through this insight, I propose we find both a definition and a usefulness for the concept of the sacred. Sacredness is no doubt an old-fashioned idea. If we are to wonder about what is sacred, we will, in a sense, volunteer ourselves for some foolishness. We will become voluntary Sisyphuses, pondering the value of drinking the poison that makes punishment into illusory bliss. But the other way to think about sacredness is in terms of the inescapable arbitration of meaning. It is to consider humans as the meaning-making, pattern-seeking beings we are. As we have seen by way of Benatar's misrepresentation of psych studies, that is, his putting the cart before the horse of those illusions that make us function in a more healthy and happy and generous way, and having no stasis from which to derive a useful meaning of mental illusion, well then, voluntary self-deception might just as well be the alternative to dysfunction. The conclusion I propose we draw is that rationality does not map onto meaning. In truth, given the Gödelian nature of existence, rationality does not map onto itself. It too can only be thought of as a relationship between things. For example, returning to Richard Taylor, in the same brief but punchy essay on the meaning of life, he paints a picture of the glowworms in a cave in New Zealand, blindly metabolizing and unknowingly glowing, where occasionally an insect will stick to them and be consumed. At the end of their life cycle, they will turn into segmented adult insects for only 2 days, lacking mouthparts and likely not making it out of the cave. They mate, lay their eggs, and are cannibalized by the worms. What's the point, you might ask? What's the logic? Well, rationality doesn't map onto such a thing. It's absurd to say that they'd be better off not eating one another and living the adult form long enough to build a temple or write a symphony. Equally, it's absurd to say they exist for their own sake because in order to do that, they have to exist in the first place. Cause must precede effect, even for us. What we can conclude from this is that there is some arbitrary value judgment in meaning, or the point of, or the rationality we're applying to the situation as humans, all of which has no impact on the existence nor the desires of the worms. We cannot help them to be more worm-congruent, nor would we be helping them by insisting they be less worm-congruent, and anyway, neither of those would appear to be our implicit aim in asking what is the logic of their being. In the absence of a referent or a particularly well-formed value system, we can say that the worms would be better off not existing, or better never to have been. But this is equally unfounded and self-referential. It's entirely arbitrary and, frankly, irrational. Rationality itself, under an ontology of relationships, can only be somewhat well-formed and consistent. It would seem to be vulnerable to both subjective and cultural biases, a problem we will expand upon later, but for now take for granted, given that at least sometimes rational systems underpin forms of scientific bigotry and authoritarianism, as well as, at least occasionally, perpetuating value systems which are actively harmful and evil. Clearly, this loose idea of rational can be imbued with different arbitrary values, different aims, limits, and starting conditions. As a system to interrogate all of existence, including such esoteric ideas as the meaning of life or whether it would be better not to exist at all, the purely rational begins to mean different things to different people. Whatever conclusion we start with, existing is better or existing is worse, is supported in a recursive and iterative battle of subsystems and metasystems, all describing themselves incapable of jumping out of the starting assumptions and conditions of the rationality itself, just as we are incapable of jumping out of being human or out of the subjective experience of existing. Benatar is sure that it would be better if the worms did not exist because their existence is pointless and full of suffering. I could argue that it is better that they do exist because the point of their existence is the emergent eccentricity of reality itself, and whatever they experience is worth it because of the sheer value of being a worm. Immediately, you can see hints of the underlying value systems that exist for each of us. What is pointless? What is a point? What is suffering? What is too much suffering? What is worth it? Hell, what is the value of a worm? Neither of us has an as opposed to what to jump into that isn't itself formed of the initial value system. From this, we can conclude that these creative value systems are very real. They formulate a very real element of each of our conceptual realms of being and reality. It would seem that no matter how cautiously one approaches a value system of pure rationality, no matter how closely that rationality models empiricism, parsimony, and the scientific method, that nonetheless any system of pure rationality cannot be formulated without some manner of creative and arbitrary value system underlying it. And subjects who formulate such theories of rationality and value are, of course, subjective and cultural beings. Value systems are composed of subjective and arbitrary reference points beyond which further divisibility is either personally or categorically impossible. Such indivisible units of absolute meaning, though perhaps a point of disagreement between cultures, perhaps even laughably arbitrary to an outside observer, are nonetheless that, and only that which, human beings deem meaningful. That is, arguing over a value system is always arguing over what you deem sacred, even if you think you have out-rationalized such primitive concerns as sacredness. Cultures can be thought of as collective systems in which value is negotiated, and these sacrednesses, or indivisible points of meaning, are agreed upon. That which lies beyond pure language, pure logic, pure purpose, or whatever describable detail of implication, innuendo, irony, narrative, hyperbole, and other nested modes of communication, is the meaning of things, and that meaning is always cultural and subjective and prone to disagreement. The sacred is that beyond which there can be no further division nor arbitration of meaning or of illusion. This sacredness is, nonetheless, cultural and subjective and arbitrary. An absolute meaning which satisfies every cultural and subjective definition is impossible, and the task of drawing up a meta-system that might encompass such varied arbitration is, ironically enough, a Sisyphean one. For Benatar, suffering is sacred. To him, there is no beyond suffering, no conceptual flaw to undermine the usefulness of the frame of suffering. If one is truly suffering, one is suffering, and this is an objective fact. If one only believes they are suffering still, and it is still an objective fact. If one believes that they are not suffering, they are still suffering at the ultimate and most indivisible level. Suffering is the normative mode of reality to David Benatar. Joy is divisible and interrogable in a way that suffering is indivisible and absolute. In such terms, it might be harder to see his position as a rational one, rather a personal one. However, such irrationality is not peculiar to Benatar, nor does it function as evidence of a poor thinker. The idea that rational beliefs exist outside of the primitive human illusion of sacredness is itself ignorant of the problem that rationality is a human value system, arbitrated by the very sanctities it would seek to disprove. Rationality does not map onto itself, and the sacred, when taken as these indivisible units of human meaning-making, forms networks of thought as inescapable as assigned meaning itself. For me, being is sacred. I find that it is being that is in some sense indivisible, and I hold that all other values follow from that initial primary value. Something cannot be valuable by its not being. Something cannot be valuable unless it is, or it was. In the accompanying video, I describe this as seeing things value first. The dreaming or planning of something can be valuable, but the non-dreaming or non-planning of something cannot be valuable. Future generations can be valuable, and future generations will have values, but only in as much as things will be. That which we make of the world now can have value to those who will come to be. However, the potential non-being of future generations, their extinction, whether by accident or intention, is not valuable. It cannot be valued. There is a different statement I could make about this extinction, of course. The potential blossoming of life in a human-free world is valuable. A different kind of valuable, but valuable nonetheless. The potential evolution of storytelling, meaning-making beings in such a world, the opportunity for non-human life to become such, or just to muck about in caves glowing and blindly metabolizing, is all valuable. Those are existent things. It is from this indivisible unit of meaning that I derive the robustness of the non-referent problem in replying to Benatar. But I will recognize, in fact embrace, that this is my own arbitrary value system. This value system cannot encompass objective adjudication. It cannot encompass both the states of being and non-being, and it cannot encompass infinite potential outcomes in all existent states. The value of being has no as opposed to what of its own, and I cannot jump out of it. At a certain stage in the interrogation, it must be admitted that this is a point of divergence from Benatar that is, for want of a better way of putting it, personal. A matter of taste, if you like, which is subjective, cultural, and arbitrary. And at least in the way that I frame it, our individual value systems are essentially a disagreement over what we regard as sacred. But the meta-system to describe what our value systems are is also, and consequently, a point of divergence. For Benatar, his system is an absolute, a proof of the asymmetry of suffering. For me, with my ontology of relationships, as someone who experiences and describes reality only as the relationships between things, who therefore sees absolutes as misleading formations of these relationships, it makes sense that I would frame things in terms of these subjective reference points of sacredness instead, and that I would find such a point of personal arbitrary divergence in the concept of suffering. Unfortunately, an arbitrary disagreement which is wrapped up in irreconcilable but absolute differences is a source of conflict as old as time. So, rather than try to argue the ethical equivalent of transubstantiation, with each of us quite sure the other one is the Catholic, I will turn to a more useful attribute of an ontology of relationships, which is shared by the psych studies' focus on human suffering, and Taylor's framing of Sisyphean meaning, and the majority of the other cheerful folk assailing Benatar's Tower of Suffering. That is, usefulness itself. Returning to Sisyphus. I have argued that everything thus far is, on some level, a reflection of arbitrary subjectivity and a creative value system of some kind or another, so that therefore each side is as unprovable as the other. But that is not to say that both sides are equally unhelpful, or even equal in terms of ethics. Because if we are to combat suffering in either its objective or illusory forms, then we must arbitrate between things, because the alternative is to make a useless category of all forms of suffering, in which the experience of starvation and warfare is equated with occasionally needing to go for a poo or wishing you had a bigger house. I will argue in the next chapter that Benatar constructs just such a useless taxonomy, and that it is, at points, dangerous. Briefly, before then, as briefly as I can manage, there is another interpretation of the myth of Sisyphus I would like to present. His betrayal of the law of hospitality is somewhat glossed over generally, but I should like to pick it apart, bearing in mind that the ancient Greeks granted this concept of xenia enough sanctity that they put Zeus himself in charge of it. and bearing in mind that hospitality towards strangers and dissolving the hermetically sealed unit of individualist ownership is arguably something the modern subject could benefit from, let us consider for a moment the nature of Sisyphus's punishment in relation to this crime specifically. Xenia was an honor-bound concept of hospitality towards strangers. Guests should be fed, bathed, offered shelter, and it was considered rude to ask questions before they had eaten. Equally, guests were to respect their hosts, to not be a threat or burden, to bring stories and news, and to reciprocate the hospitality should they be visited in the future. I can underscore that this was not merely hospitality amongst Greeks, there was no such formal category anyway, and it was not revoked during times of war or between enemies. This code of ethics was absolute. You were hospitable to everyone, it was good for the world, and it was the way things were. So Sisyphus was, in this context, a real dick. He broke the law of hospitality and presumably caught his guests pretty unaware when he murdered them. He took the sacred and committed a profanity against it. Now, in the eyes of the gods, or in your eyes, this might be less egregious than his next crime of capturing Thanatos and temporarily sabotaging the natural process of death. It could easily be overshadowed by such metaphysical mischief. But are the crimes so unrelated? If we consider the initial breaking of a sanctity as one that was taboo and unethical but possible, that is, within human grasp, and the next crime as its own breaking of a sanctity, that is, death is real, and that this is an indivisible part of meaning and existence, but one which is more bold and superhuman, then how might we view the punishment for all of the above? Meaninglessness is the punishment. If Sisyphus thought he was above the limitations of meaning, if he thought that his freedom and power were somehow a greater force than the arbitrary limitations of sacredness, then he would find himself in the reality of an existence without sacredness. He would find himself facing the consequences of a world without meaning. This makes even more sense if we look at the nature of the mercies we are compelled to imagine for Sisyphus. The hill might become his home, the rock his friend. He might one day die. A mercy in itself might be granted. A passer-by might interact. In short, he might be granted some more hospitality in reality, or some bedrock of meaning. Other myths exist in this fashion. While they are often reduced to some competition between foolish mortals and petty gods, some curtailing of our power, they might better be thought of as reminders of the functional and/or useful value of sacredness, however arbitrary and unjust that sacredness might at first glance seem. The Tower of Babel reached beyond our material limitations, and so we were struck down with insurmountable meaninglessness and difference. The forbidden fruit of the Garden of Eden removed us from a state of absolute communion with existence into a state where we are aware of our own suffering and arbitration. Douglas Hofstadter paints his own parable in Gödel Escher Bach when he says, quote, "All the limitative theorems of metamathematics and the theory of computation suggest that once the ability to represent your own structure has reached a certain critical point, that is the kiss of death. It guarantees that you can never represent yourself totally. Gödel's incompleteness theorem, Church's undecidability theorem, Turing's halting theorem, Tarski's truth theorem all have the flavor of some ancient fairy tale which warns you that to seek self-knowledge is to embark on a journey which will always be incomplete, cannot be charted on any map, will never halt, cannot be described." End quote. A helpful way to think about meaning, indeed a system of meaning that renders the word meaning as meaningful, is that meaning must always be a relationship between two things. There is a recursive loop in considering the meaningfulness of one's own actions. If it is a problem that we cannot map full and absolute meaning onto our minds as we, so to speak, inhabit and compose that meaning, then it is a similar problem to that of a non-being that is better off, or an objective adjudicator who knows us but is not us. Or perhaps there is no absolute non-meaning, simply because, as opposed to what? Rather than this functioning as a proof of absolute non-meaning, this logical exercise serves only as a reminder of the strange recursive loops that form when the meaning-making machines that are human minds use the meaning-making tools of human logic and language to tackle questions of absolute meaning, through myth and philosophy alike. We cannot adjudicate from an objective position, and our attempts to do so render us with a rationality that is irrational, a meaning that is meaningless, a Tower of Babel collapsed into 1,000 foreign tongues, a rock which we must push up a hill we know not why. Meaning is always a relationship between things, and relationships between things are in turn composed of relationships between things. It is only subjective meaning that exists, or, if you grant a substantive difference to the distinction, collective subjective meaning which we think of as cultural. Such meaning can be gleaned in the indivisible points where we find subjective bedrock, and no further divisibility or arbitration of meaning is possible or desirable. But those points of indivisibility are themselves subjective and or cultural. They are not, in fact cannot be, absolute. Think of freedom or free will as something of an indivisible unit of meaning, which is nevertheless a concept with Western, and largely modern, values baked into it. It isn't at all the same thing to an elder Japanese person from their collectivist culture as it is to a middle-aged American from their individualist culture. However, for many of us, trying to smash the atom of freedom might still feel like a strange and fruitless, perhaps even debased thing to do. For such people, they know freedom when they see it, and certainly they know when freedom is impinged upon. Freedom, under such meaning-making systems, is one of the units from which meaning and value is derived. So, beneath freedom, there is only an unhelpful and even unreal system of relativism that perhaps ruins the human experience. I find the word sacred useful for such indivisible points of meaning. Those of us who can get by with such personal modes of meaning, however we regard their arbitrariness, do seem to be the cheerful ones. However, that cheerfulness is not a useful indicator of how illusory our worldview is. At least, it is no more an indicator of illusion than its counterpart, despair. Chapter 4. Useless Taxonomy. As the world human population grows, the number of deaths increases. David Benatar. A Taxonomy of Horrors. Chapter 3 of Better Never to Have Been lays out a lengthy and overwhelming list of various modes of suffering. Natural disasters, disease, plague, war, rape, assault, maiming, murder, maltreatment of children, enslavement, unjust incarceration, shunning, humiliation, oppression. A dizzying array is catalogued, from unflinchingly extreme to comically mundane. Quote, hunger, thirst, bowel and bladder distension as those organs become filled, tiredness, stress, thermal discomfort, that is, feeling either too hot or too cold, and itch. Allergies, headaches, frustration, irritation, colds, menstrual pains, hot flushes, nausea, hypoglycemia, seizures, guilt, shame, boredom, sadness, depression, loneliness, body image dissatisfaction, the ravages of AIDS, of cancer, and of other such life-threatening diseases, and grief and bereavement. The reach of negative mental states in ordinary lives is extensive. End quote. It is a list of such impressive volume that you might find yourself quite overwhelmed by the time you stagger across the threshold into Chapter 4, which is, I think, the idea. In order to establish that our experience of suffering is overdetermined, even without a referable context to compare it to, Benatar has to define suffering in the fullest and most multifarious way imaginable. Of course, it would be petty and dishonest for me to quibble over the absoluteness of a great number of the modes of suffering listed above. Dying of starvation, having a bomb dropped on you and your family, being tortured, and so on. No real justifying context could be presented, or certainly there is limited reasonableness with which any justifying context could be presented. Indeed, we might begin to form a useful taxonomy by finding such examples, by categorizing those modes of suffering that exist outside of any possible justifying context, the sort of suffering that happens to innocent folk for no good reason, and does not form part of any greater struggle or project, and in general is just always bad. This would be, by its very nature, in contrast to an inverse list of those modes of suffering which are more complex, which may be productive sometimes, or contextual, or subjective, and so on. This would be a useful taxonomy. We could propose many uses for such a distinction. Example 1. There is a useful distinction between suffering by way of oppression imposed in a blanket fashion on a group, and therefore experienced in material ways by individuals in that group, and extra suffering experienced by activists opposing this oppression, and perhaps therefore experiencing worse oppression. If an individual freedom fighter is harassed or beaten or unlawfully incarcerated or tortured or killed, particularly because of their actions in struggling for the emancipation of their oppressed group, then the difference between their suffering as marginalized and suffering as revolutionary should matter a great deal. We could expect it would matter a great deal to them. To compartment both modes of suffering as essentially equal is to erode the discrete meaning of their struggle, counter both to the individual revolutionaries' meaning-making and, to a pretty reasonable degree, counter to reality. To disregard the point of such a struggle as achieving only temporary good, only temporary joy, and ultimately as a fruitless aim in the cold and indifferent cosmos is in fact more than a useless categorization. It is a harm. Example 2. There is a useful distinction between hunger as experienced by the impoverished and hunger as experienced in ritual fasting. To compartment both as essentially the same is to erode the discrete meaning and, rather selectively, the usefulness of context, culture, and meaning in how we experience material stimuli. That is, those hungers do not seem to be the same experience at all. Those disparate causes and contexts lead not only to different subjective reports or narratives, they would seem to lead to different neurochemical experiences too, a material reality emerging from culture and sacredness. In popular terms, at least, one of these forms of hunger is bad, and the other is beautiful. Example 3. There is a useful distinction between sleep deprivation as a means of torture and sleep deprivation from having a newborn baby. We find that to interrogate suffering in this fashion produces useful distinctions in almost every case. Even if we hold that there are many unjust and unjustifiable modes of absolute suffering, the process of distinguishing those from other modes of suffering is a fruitful task in itself. Benatar, and other materialists with non-referent problems, are happy to dismiss the fleeting moments of joy in our lives as illusory, and will use psych material to back up this claim, such as the over-relied upon Pollyanna principle. But as is usually made clear in the source research, the distinction between different modes of suffering matter a great deal in the practice of medicine. If we can distinguish, for example, between rational and irrational anxiety, then we can approach treating one without impacting a patient's ability to reason. Distinguishing between different kinds of pain has diagnostic utility. Medicine, as a whole and generally speaking, is a human practice which attempts to mitigate suffering within the limits of material reality, within the limits of human knowledge, and other limits like cost and side effects. Particularly in the case of psychology, the experience of suffering must be distinguished from other forces, and therefore context is everything. Medicine must engage with suffering and the details and context of that suffering. As a result, medicine is often ruthlessly pragmatic, as we might see in an emergency triage situation or a life-saving amputation, etc. The preservation of life is usually a bedrock value in medicine, but this is not to the exclusion of considering quality of life. In certain cases, for instance locked-in syndrome or extreme chronic pain, real ethical debates take place all the time, and various national and cultural norms shift constantly on issues like euthanasia. It follows that, by shifting the threshold so far back as to incorporate all of these various modes of suffering somewhat indiscriminately, Benatar proposes a system which is absurdly amenable to euthanasia. This is what I mean by a useless taxonomy. It seems to only have one use, to justify the conclusion that it would be better if we never existed. I will attempt to show that there are several such instances of useless taxonomy, or at least unevenly distributed categorization, pervading Benatar's work. Further, I will attempt to show that each comes with its own hierarchical assumptions and potentially oppressive implications, and that this is a feature and not a bug of Benatar's general value system. As a brief example, at one point Benatar writes, quote, "While most people think that living without a limb does not make life so bad that it is worth ending, most of the same people also think it is better not to bring into existence someone who will lack a limb." End quote. While I certainly hope that this is not what most people think, such a flimsy threshold for a life not worth living is a galling detail in Benatar's worldview, one which exposes how foundationally hierarchical his perspective is. This is without the need to point to ableism in particular. What we're seeing here is a structural issue which will follow from any value system that gives primacy of existence only to modes of suffering. If our innate beauty, brilliance, idiosyncrasy, magic, culture, subjective meaning, personal projects, and so on are all without value, then we are all an unfortunate cast of NPCs failing to various degrees to meet a standard of normalcy, and because some of us fail to meet that standard more than others, we of course suffer all the more for it. Disability and inability. In Chapter 4, Having Children, the Antinatal View, Benatar spends considerable time explaining and responding to the social construction of disability. This is my favorite part of the book, not because it represents the strongest argument, and not because I'm autistic and can relate to the social construction of disability argument. No, it's simply because this is the part of the book that made me laugh hardest. This model of disability, in as much as Benatar presents it, can be understood quite straightforwardly. The lack of certain abilities, like sight or the ability to walk, might be real material facts for an individual and not, in that sense, socially constructed, but it is only social arrangements that make those things into disabilities. In other words, if everyone moved about on wheelchairs, then everywhere in human society would be designed to accommodate wheelchairs. As it stands, there are plenty of places in the natural world that do not accommodate upright perambulation on two human legs, but the sorts of environments that we construct accommodate upright bipeds first and foremost. This is what is meant by disability being a social construction. In some forms of advocacy, a distinction is drawn between disability and inability. As Benatar puts it, quote, "Disability rights advocates may note that everybody has inabilities. No human beings have the ability to fly, unaided by machines, but this fact does not disable the wingless, because buildings are made accessible to the wingless by means of ground floor entrances and stairs, ramps, or lifts. We do not think about this because winglessness is the human norm. If most people had wings and a few did not, then those few would be disabled if no accommodations were made for them." End quote. You may wonder why such care is put into fairly representing this argument by disability advocates in a body of work dedicated to the benefits of extinction. Well, that is because Benatar agrees with the social construction model, but in a very specific way. He thinks that the fact that we can't fly, and the fact of all of the other inabilities that our imaginations could dream up, is further evidence of the asymmetry of suffering and joy. As he says, quote, "Disability rights advocates are correct to note that usual inabilities are ignored in quality of life assessments. They are mistaken, however, in taking that response to normal inabilities as the standard and in wanting to ignore unusual inabilities too. Instead, we should be considering all inabilities in assessing the quality of lives. While it is true that the social environment does minimize the impact that usual inabilities have on quality of life, many of them do nonetheless adversely impact on quality of life. Paraplegics may require special access to public transport, but the inability of everybody to fly or to cover long distances at great speed means that even those who can use their legs require transportation aids. Our lives surely go less well for being so dependent. Our lives also go less well because we are susceptible to hunger and thirst, that is, unable to go without food and water, heat and cold, and so on. In other words, even if disability is socially constructed, the inabilities and other unfortunate features that characterize normal human lives are enough to make our lives go very badly, indeed much worse than we usually recognize." End quote. One way of looking at what Benatar is doing here is to consider it another useless taxonomy, that is, a value system without value in which all imaginable modes of being should be weighted against the general mode of being. This is a world which is tragic because we need to eat, we have legs, we can't fly. The fact that we can't see ultraviolet light is a tragedy after all, because he evaluates our lives against not just one imagined referent, but all imaginable referents. Now, by the same logic, it is possible to propose that we consider ourselves fortunate when we can picture so many hells and so much agony, but I don't consider it useful to meet Benatar's imagined realities with imagined realities of my own. Instead, I want to ask, what is the threshold of inability in the social construction of disability? Why is the threshold placed where it is? It would seem that the threshold is whether or not something is a normative inability. If we consider the inability to fly as a normative inability, everyone has it, then we could consider something like the inability to walk as a non-normative inability. Only a percentage of people have it. The threshold for inability, in terms of its relationship to the social construction of disability, is whether or not said inability is normative. And why? Well, it would seem that this way of thinking about the variables and their relationships maintains the two relevant usefulnesses in question, the usefulness of paraplegia being something we need to accommodate, and the usefulness of its being a human state, which is only as non-normative as being queer or neurodivergent. If the threshold is all inability, then the category loses its usefulness. Quite apart from that, it becomes impossible to define. There are, after all, a virtually infinite number of inabilities we could imagine, and the particular alternate modes of being are subject to serious selection bias, depending on the flavor of imagination that is conjuring them up. Certainly, when we listen to David Benatar's imagination, we find that all modes of being work out better than the one we're stuck with. If we return to Christian Pillar, we could say that Benatar is failing to compare these inabilities to anything. Or we could return to David Spirit, who makes a similar observation about the absurd categories we end up with, following Benatar's reasoning. Quote, "It's not that we can't make sense of the idea of absence of a state because of the absence of whatever it can be a state of. We recognize that, in some sense, slaughtering the poor would lead to poverty reduction, and that firing everybody would mean that there would be no workplace accidents, but those are unusual interpretations, not what we're normally thinking or intending when we support poverty reduction or reduced workplace accidents. What we mean is more like less poverty without losing people, or fewer accidents without reduced employment." End quote. The non-ethics of non-ambiguity. You may have already spotted that there is some significant crossover between these three overarching critiques of Benatar's worldview: cause and effect, unreliable narrator, and useless taxonomy, if not complete equivalence. The lack of a referent that can be spared misery is the same as the lack of a cause for an effect. The lack of a position from which to objectively adjudicate joy or suffering or the meaning of life is its own non-referent problem, and all of the above can be thought of as a useless and unprovable taxonomy. To put it another way, David Benatar sets the threshold between good and bad in the same spot as the threshold between existence and non-existence, and this makes all further developments of the system impossible to prove or derive useful value from. This is his first assertion and his terminating thought on the subject, and all of his interpretations of life must then bend or be brushed aside to conform to this initial set of conditions. Unfortunately, he can never prove the position itself. There is no one who has ever not existed. No one who has ever not existed has ever been better off. Nothing that has ever not existed has had benefits. It's unprovable to say that we are better off in absolute terms for exactly the same reasons. However, the set of conditions for beings that exist compose a more useful taxonomy because it is possible to categorize conditions that exist in terms of how they are better than each other. That is, when things exist, it is possible to discover the relationships between them that make them good or bad. So all things that can be better off belong to the category of things that exist, and all the conditions of being better off are in relation to other conditions. All of the useless taxonomies plaguing Benatar's worldview stem from his lumping together all conditions as worse than non-existence. This is why he ends up with a non-comprehensive list of genocide and hunger and sleep deprivation and boredom and occasionally needing to go for a poo. This is why not being able to fly is made equivalent to not being able to walk. Benatar makes the assertion that we would be better off having never been born, and he does so by making meaningless the concept of being better off. We could presume that Benatar arrived on this miscalculation not purely because of a depressive outlook, but, at least in part, because of this absolutist ontology, in which a value, such as suffering, can have some pure existence beyond cause and effect, indeed beyond existence itself. This is a sympathetic position. Philosophy is the pursuit of truth, however unpleasant that truth might be. In many ways, it can be upsetting or discommoding or incomprehensible to imagine that all value is subjective, that all meaning is creative. Surely something exists in absolute terms. Surely that thing is suffering. Or perhaps it's ambiguity. Since we don't know what value to ascribe non-existence, or even say a discrete non-existence like the non-existence of humans, perhaps ambiguity itself is more of a true absolute than suffering. Since we don't know that nature is cruel, after all, cruel is a human value, perhaps nature is ambiguous. Since we don't know that the universe is empty of life beyond Earth, and regardless, we don't know that it is cold or even indifferent, as you'll be aware, those are also human values, it is more honest to say that the universe is ambiguous. So perhaps a value does exist beyond cause and effect, indeed beyond existence itself. Perhaps that value is ambiguity. Here we have a strange loop, because no matter what value we try to ascribe to the real and the beyond and the objective and the non-existent, we find it has its source in us. It doesn't emerge from nature despite us, rather it is projected onto nature.
Any absolute value will come with Gödelian limits, always either somewhat poorly formed or somewhat inconsistent. If we say that the absolute value is ambiguity, then it's not very well formed. If we say that the absolute value is suffering, then it's a little more well formed, but it's far less consistent. If we say that the absolute value is love, then it's not particularly well formed or consistent, though it is pretty. But ambiguity, to me, makes for the most useful taxonomy. Simone de Beauvoir describes the state of human being as an ambiguity between subjectivity, pure internality against which no external power can take hold, and objectivity, a thing crushed by the dark weight of other things. Quote, "This privilege which he alone possesses of being a sovereign and unique subject amidst a universe of objects is what he shares with all his fellow men. In turn an object for others, he is nothing more than an individual in the collectivity on which he depends. As long as there have been men, and they have lived, they have felt this tragic ambiguity of their condition. But as long as there have been philosophers and they have thought, most of them have tried to mask it." End quote. De Beauvoir's great insight is that freedom cannot exist without this ambiguity. It is from one's own nothing, a nothingness within, that choices are made. But we are also things to one another, and so our freedom is fundamentally tied up in the impact of others upon us, and in our impact upon others. It makes sense that when systems are proposed that have absolute values, or absolute governing rules that exist beyond discrete cause and effect and perhaps beyond existence itself, we end up with some form of, at least soft, determinism, in which all things are determined by starting conditions and there is no free will, in spite of this being at odds with the freedom we experience. Therefore that freedom, under almost all absolutist systems, must then be categorized as some subjective illusion. Returning to Douglas Hofstadter and Gödel Escher-Bach, the seminal text on the self-referential nature of reality, quote, "One way to gain some perspective on the free will question is to replace it by what I believe is an equivalent question, but one which involves less loaded terms. Instead of asking, does System X have free will, we ask, does System X make choices?" End quote. Taking the Hofstadter view, there is a symbolic representation of selfhood in our mind. We observe ourselves acting in the world. There is also a set of other symbols for all the other things in the world. Hofstadter proposes that what we call free will is, quote, "a result of the interaction between the self-symbol, or subsystem, and all of the other symbols in the brain," end quote. He proposes we imagine a robot in a maze. In the first iteration of the thought experiment, the robot makes a move to the left or to the right by arbitrary means which are unknown to it, when a particular number is even or odd, for example. All it sees in its mind is a black box spitting out L for left and OR for right. We could not imagine that such a robot is making decisions. However, quote, "if we allow its symbols, including its self-symbol, to affect the decision that is taken, now here is an example of a program running fully under physical law, which seems to get much more deeply at the essence of choice than the previous examples did. When the robot's own chunked concept of itself enters the scene, we begin to identify with the robot, for it sounds like the kind of thing we do. At this stage, meaning has entered the picture, the same kind of meaning as we manipulate with our own minds." End quote. All of which is not to advance a proof of free will, nor is it to propose a more well-formed or consistent metaphysics than Benatar. I am only attempting to demonstrate something meaningful and useful beyond the initial claim that cause and effect only exist in existent systems. Now I am saying that choices only happen when there is a self-image to manipulate, and thereby a self-referential loop, and thereby an ambiguity between objectivity and subjectivity. And ethics only happen when there are choices. Benatar proposes a non-ethics of non-ambiguity. His list of miseries is so universal and overwhelming as to not be worth manipulating one way or the other. Everything that happens after the point of coming to existence is more bad than good, and so the only true moral action is the prevention of existence. This forms a meta-condition in which all other ethical acts are secondary. This isn't just demotivating, it's also problematic in that all modes of meaning-making, beauty, art, love, culture, accomplishment, that is, ethical action in the positive as opposed to the preventative, is marginalized and trivialized. Even when there is scientific evidence that narrative prevents suffering, even when that evidence is cited by Benatar himself, still suffering, almighty suffering, is rendered supreme and absolute quite arbitrarily. The ethical action is made secondary in favor of something that Benatar presents as objective, but it is not. As long as the state of non-being is unknowable, then there is ambiguity as to exactly what being should be. As long as there is a self-symbol in our minds and we are manipulating the actions of that being, then there is ambiguity as to the effect we can have on the world and the sorts of things we can do about suffering and joy. A moral imperative to act as if there is free will and good to be done and so forth. A moral imperative to act as if there is a moral imperative. And as long as there is ambiguity between our subjective experience and all of the reports from the other beings out there, and there is a creative component to formulating values and formulating moral action, and as long as there is that conversation between all these subject objects, as long as there is culture and mutual intelligibility, then some values are going to be more ambiguous than others. Absolute good and absolute bad, as categories, begin to approach absurdity. It is only these relationships that can inform our actions and our ethics. Indeed, it is only these relationships and their predictive power in ascertaining the future that can inform whether or not you, personally, should have a child.
Chapter 5. Personal Ontologies. Although until now I have presented my arguments as if they are largely interchangeable, that an objective universal view is just as much a non-referent as a being who never existed, and that oscillating between the view of one and the other is the same as oscillating between the benefit of one and the other, and that in any case, all of the above tackles only an unusable view of suffering or better off that leads to weak and untenable ethics, I wish now to return to a key point from Chapter 3, in which I admitted that certain of these views are inseparable from my own personal subjectivity. Crucially, they are inseparable from anyone's subjectivity. They are, as it were, a matter of taste. I wish to show that all ideologies are personal, and that all rational inquiry, as much as it might be drawing on empirical observations or absolute arithmetic deductions or pure abstract isomorphisms, is nonetheless always at least somewhat ideological. This is especially true of claims that lack an as opposed to inverse or other relational referent, because the as opposed to referent will exist one way or the other simply by the nature of the self-referential loops of existence and human thought. Without making a best guess at the alternate causal outcomes that you're drawing reference from, you end up constructing fragile Benatar claims such as "Our lives surely go less well for being so dependent," or "No desires for that which we lack are ever satisfied immediately. Such a desire must be present before it can be satisfied, and thus we endure a period of frustration before the desire is fulfilled," or "Better never to have been." Again, for the umpteenth time, this is not to accuse Benatar of being uniquely duplicitous, nor even of being particularly self-deceptive. This is a claim about non-referential claims. When S, subjective claim, is said to be in relation, better, worse, etc., but there is no defined O, objective claim, to be in relation to, then O is 1. Implied, and 2. Informed by the biases of the claimer and those witnessing the claim. These poorly formed statements can in themselves be argued to make up only part of the structure of Benatar's arguments between well-formed statements. This is the spirit of fair play with which I consumed his various works. Unfortunately, the opposite would seem to be true. These are the claims upon which the asymmetry is built, that we would be better off and that our lives go less well. The absence of a referent is baked in. But we've been through this. I have stated and restated that Benatar's worldview collapses under a system in which better is a relationship between two existent states. Supposing now, instead, we move towards those extremes of reference where nothing lies beyond, where cause can no longer precede effect, where the absence of a reference point cannot be helped. Suppose we consider the events and conditions preceding the Big Bang, presuming to follow a school of thought where such an event took place. Certain models in theoretical physics state that before that event, time and space did not exist. Time, if we think of it as another reflection of our cause and effect axiom, is impossible to imagine not existing. As soon as you picture the state of events beyond or before the Big Bang, in which time does not exist, and any manner of moment passes, your imagination has failed. If you picture some colorful nonsense oblivion, equally you have pictured space, and you have failed. I use this example to make useful the metaphor of Gödel's incompleteness theorem, Tarski's truth, Turing's uncomputability, etc. If our minds are the machine onto which infinite possibilities are mapped, there are baked-in limitations to the sorts of realities such a machine can map. Namely, they're all realities in which mapping realities takes place, in some form or another. So when we imagine absolute ontologies, we are not jumping out of a reality founded on cause and effect, we are projecting cause and effect onto the abyss. When we make claims that do not have explicit reference, our implicit reference are projected onto the abyss in their place. When we selectively imagine alternate worlds in which all humans can fly, but not worlds in which all humans writhe in agony, this is not an objective proof, it is a demonstration of taste. So I come around again to the personal difference in value systems which marked my departure from Benatar on the high hill at Tartarus. Where Taylor's modification for Benatar marked a deeply troubling insight into the unprovability of objective meaning, that even if we imagine Sisyphus happy, he might only be happy because he is brainwashed, and he would never know the difference. For me, and I think perhaps for Taylor, the modification proves that ambiguity itself is closer to absolute than either good or bad. Again, when there is no higher order than Sisyphus's experience, that is, no layer of complexity that we have access to beyond his subjective account, then we have a non-referent problem. The problem is baked into the thought experiment. We only have Sisyphus's word that he is happy. We subjectively adhere to an interpretation of the situation, and that interpretation is a projection of our subjective value system onto Sisyphus. When the question itself is one of absolute value, that is, meaning from the point of view of the universe, there is no jumping out of human subjectivity to prove or disprove such a value in its absoluteness. There is only our projection of creative value depending on what we personally, subjectively care about and therefore project onto the abyss. Benatar does not imagine, per se, that his non-existence would be better, more comfortable, or less miserable than his own horrific existence. He frequently draws a distinction between a life already underway and a life never lived, and besides, the 13 Reasons Why fallacy is not so idiotic nor simplistic, it is more fluid than that. But he does imagine some manner of non-existent state and some manner of existent state for all of us. He must, or he wouldn't have access to proposing their contrast. Whether or not he represents the view in its most vulnerable state, Benatar attributes the value of some manner of imaginable non-existence. Otherwise, he could not say that it is better. I will now attempt to show how this arbitration is consistent with a web of Benatar's other views, which are often irrational, hierarchical, colonial, and so on. Earlier I flagged that this avenue of criticism would be personal, but it's arguably more complex than that. I have saved until last this pillar of my argument because these other views of Benatar's form the weakest point of any interrogation of his antinatalist view. But what follows is nonetheless quite relevant. Benatar, the ethicist, has made many of his views clear on how we should live, with or without an antinatalist underpinning. He has made his views clear on groups of people under identitarian frameworks and how some of us delude ourselves more and do more harm than others. I will argue that these propositions of Benatar's do not prevent harm, and they do not promote ethical action. First, I will attempt to show that a hard antinatalist view such as Benatar's must necessarily consider humans as a monolith, and that these views tend therefore to be culture blind at best or culture hostile at worst. This culture hostility forms the foundation upon which Benatar assesses humans. As I will try to show, this is a hierarchical and bigoted assessment. Culture blind. Any attempt to consider humans as a monolith of certain beliefs or modes of being or what have you is doomed to relative failure. If we once again borrow and bastardize some terms from the mathematical world of Gödel and Tarski, we could say that any well-formed statement about all humans will not be consistent, and any consistent statement will not be well-formed. That is, if we make an observation about people that is very specific, then there will be very few people about whom this observation is definitely true. And equally, if we make an observation that is true of lots and lots of people, that statement must necessarily be very vague. Unfortunately, if we make a statement that is both quite specific and applied very generally, then it is going to imply that we are discussing a very specific subset of people, whether knowingly or not. Such as when David Benatar says that, quote, while there is a duty to avoid bringing suffering people into existence, there is no duty to bring happy people into being, end quote, and combines this with saying that this is a, quote, commonly held view. Benatar provides no evidence, indeed no reference point, for why he takes this to be a commonly held view. Globally, it is not the majority view, where cultural and religious beliefs often confer a moral duty to make more people. We could interpret Benatar as meaning the common view in the secular West, but again, we have to excuse disagreements within that group, not least of which the problematic views of white supremacists. We must also concede that there is a poorly formed component to the statement. The common practice among people, after all, is a pronatal one. This implies that even in the secular West, people reproduce despite having no duty to reproduce, or at least not commonly believing that they have a duty to reproduce. Perhaps Benatar just means it is a commonly held view amongst the sort of people likely to read his book, and therefore the self-referential loop is both conveniently self-fulfilling and obscured by the fact that we all like to think we're the objective ones. Regardless, there is an entirely other inconsistency at play here, and that is whether or not an observation matches our intuition, and what it means for an observation to match our intuition or not. Invoking once again the premise of Chapter 3, the Unreliable Narrator, I can point out that Benatar is using our intuition to support a claim in its being generally true as we might expect, that it is a commonly held view. But he has at other points in his argument made no secret of how unreliable our intuition is. He has in fact weaponized this. One example, quote, "Many are happy to have come into being because they enjoy their lives, but these appraisals are mistaken," end quote. How can a commonly held view be a form of evidence at one point in a value system, but a disruption of greater objectivity from the point of view of the universe at another? Simply because Benatar is mistaken about his own objectivity and about cultural subjectivity. He oscillates between these opposed ways of compartmenting commonly held views in the singular pursuit of a conclusion that came first, that is, a view projected onto the nothingness. This oscillation between empirical human reports and disruptive human bias will manifest in any system that tries to impose statements from the view of the universe, rather than contrasting statements between existent and therefore human and therefore cultural views. By denying that he too is a cultural agent, and in so being an agent with some very specific personal and cultural baggage, Benatar, like many, falls further from objectivity than one who never tried to claim objectivity in the first place. This is what I mean by being culture blind. Nested value. As I mentioned in Chapter 4, when beauty, meaning-making, sacredness, and other such creative values are made secondary to the absoluteness of suffering, or worse, made entirely illusory, we end up with humanity as a cast of NPCs, failing to meet a standard of non-suffering. This is how Benatar assesses the child who will be born without a limb, and indeed he invokes his referentless most people agree crowd to back him up, and finds that it would be better if they had never been born. As an aside, an acquaintance of mine is a Paralympian who lost his right arm in a motorcycle accident. Whenever I see him on social media standing atop mountains and teaching children to kayak, I imagine him a great deal happier in his day-to-day life than David Benatar, but I digress. I want to take a moment to consider some pragmatic ways of approaching value that concern themselves less with proving or disproving absoluteness, and more with what that value might be and what to do with it. As I hope to have demonstrated by now, discrete joys for existent beings can only be argued against in relative terms. Any attempt to argue them out of existence is its own creative value system, laboring under the misapprehension of objectivity. That there is no absolute joy from the point of view of the universe places an arbitrary and meaningless burden on the relative value of joy as experienced and exchanged by entities that exist, like my friend Tojo with the one arm enjoying his life. We could say that items in the category of existent joys cannot be discounted from inclusion in that category by virtue of their being relative, temporary, or arbitrary. I enjoy writing this sort of pretentious philosophy stuff, and the fact that that joy is relative, temporary, and arbitrary does nothing to disprove the existence of that joy. I'm the only witness, and the joy only exists in as much as it exists to me. So what if Benatar were to argue about how mistaken I am? What if he were to point to all of the frustration I felt reading his book, the arguments I had with my partner in my hyperfixation on this project, the small but persistent backache from bending over the laptop, the moments of self-doubt, the panic, the despair, and so on? What if he were to point out all the psychological phenomena and unanswered variables that make me an unreliable narrator? I expect you might be ahead of me. Why, I'd counter with an unreliable narrator argument of my own. I'd say that Benatar is oscillating between my subjective joy, which he calls an illusion, and my subjective misery, which to him is somehow to be trusted. I counter with an accusation of useless taxonomy, that my joys are fruitless but my miseries are real, and with a non-referent problem. Would I be happier doing something else, or somehow never existing at all? But now, here at the end of the journey, where culture weighs in more heavily and densely than either myself or the South African professor, I don't need to make any of those defenses, because if I'm using this current project as the example, joy doesn't make the substance of the argument at all. If we are discussing my reasons, illusory and real, subjective and otherwise, for making this project which you are reading, then bringing me joy would be a dishonest taxonomy of its own. I am not aiming for joy. Truthfully, I know not what I am aiming for, and that is precisely why I aim. The dichotomy between joy and suffering has been a dishonest obfuscation from the beginning, especially in an assessment of human existence. Yes, there are useful categorical lists of pure suffering and maybe even of pure joy, but in reality there are infinite confusions between the two. They become diffuse as categories almost immediately in almost all cases and blend into one another, roll past one another, refuse to interact as pure opposites much of the time. There is no neat categorization of joy and suffering. Forcing their neat categorization has caused as many problems for Benatar's ethics as forcing pi to be exactly 3 would cause for geometry. His asymmetry between two opposing forces is not just a false asymmetry, they're false opposing forces too. A helpful way to think about good and bad is that they are nested. That is, no bad is so great that it does not contain some good, and no good is so pure that it does not contain some bad. But even this is an absolute and geometric oversimplification. Bad and good are categories of very limited usefulness. A set of nested categories that appeals to me is narrative and chaos. That is, what we think of as narratively satisfying and what we think of as unfortunately chaotic. The stories are nested in the mess, and the mess is made of stories. Human projects, personal, cultural, whatever, have value that does not fit either the category of joy bringer or pain maker. There is some greater emergent eccentricity at play, at least in how this theatre of value is played in by people, up to and including philosophers of ethics. And unfortunately, attempts to jump out of this theatre of values are always doomed to relative failure. I will address what I mean by relative failure briefly. I mean that attempts can and should be made to find truth that remains consistent despite all this subjective noise. Harm itself, for example, is not pure relativity, and ethics are certainly not pure creative value with no empirical or a posteriori grounding. All of this relativity is no excuse to ignore or perpetuate harm. However, I'm defining my harm in nonetheless relative and pragmatic terms, that is, existent terms. These are categories of bad with some usefulness, like medicine's taxonomy of pain. Such harm is not proved by its scale in the view of the universe, nor its meta-human existence in an asymmetry, nor is it straightforwardly mediated by a greater amount of joy coming to exist. Real harm is identified through creative value systems which are consistent and useful, such as medicine, law, a practicable ethics, or preferably a negotiation between several of the above. And if culture itself, that which produces value on the one hand but curtails freedom on the other, is the very culprit of such an existent harm, as culture so often is, then we are better armed to tackle that harm in the knowledge that we too are cultural beings, projecting our values as we go. We are best armed if we understand that harm is being measured by us, the subjective cultural agents, and that any mediation or solution that we propose is, at least in part, cultural. The illusion of objectivity is built of culture. Or to put it another way, our attempts at objectivity are nested within various and real subjectivities. Antinatalism. So, with this view of the inescapability of culture, of the immutable value of meaning-making, of the strange pi is exactly 3 misapprehensions of false objectivity, let's take one final look at antinatalism, in its own cultural and historical context as it pertains to humans, real humans, especially those for whom the colonizer has always made their extinction his fascination. Thomas Malthus was amongst the first of the Western rationalists to propose that population growth would impede utopia. A controversial figure, he certainly influenced the thinking of Charles Darwin and Herbert Spencer, and his writing would become key in inspiring social Darwinism. Various anxieties in Europe around population, changing culture, social and ethnic changes, and the advent of modernity would coalesce in the rise of fascism in the early 20th century. In The Origins of Totalitarianism, Hannah Arendt draws a clear connection between genocide and the creation of the idea of superfluous people. Dehumanization is an evil unto itself and a key element in political atrocities. Anxieties over changing demographics have historically been drummed into full-blown panic with propagandistic language like breeding, whether the Jews of 1930s Europe or the Catholics of 1970s Northern Ireland, or those from Islamist countries which are villainized currently. Their reproducing has been presented as more problematic and less human than the making of children by white people.
Early on in Better Never to Have Been, Benatar addresses an injustice between those born in a certain area and those that emigrate there. He says, quote, "Offspring have a presumed right to citizenship, while potential immigrants do not. Imagine a polarized state consisting of two opposing ethnic groups. One increases its size by breeding and the other by immigration. Depending on who holds power, the group that grows by immigration will either be prevented from growing or it will be accused of colonialism." End quote. This is, at first glance, a quite sympathetic position, particularly before we are tasked with imagining this purely hypothetical state. If I were asked my perspective on the mess, I would say that I agree that borders are silly. Anyone should live anywhere and have democratic representation there. But it is in the footnote that accompanies this statement that we see Benatar's real point. He writes, quote, "The Arab-Jewish demographic within Israel is a case in point." End quote. The anxiety about being outbred is a strong pillar of propaganda in the Zionist project, one which dehumanizes and makes non-democratic the lives of Palestinians. This is not, however, the assessment of the situation that Benatar, the ethicist, presents. Instead, breeding itself is the crime, and some of us are more guilty of it than others. You might accuse me of reading too much into this throwaway footnote, but Benatar makes no secret of his position in terms of contemporary politics. He has written a book, The Fall of the University of Cape Town, Africa's leading university in decline, which describes the university as, quote, "hostile to Israel and to those Jews and others who aren't willing to demonize Israel," end quote. He accuses UCT of surrendering to identity politics and cozying up to Hamas. He speaks with derision about identity politics and wokeness, pretty much in step with other conservative and edgy thought leaders. He has also written a book, The Second Sexism, Discrimination Against Men and Boys, which seeks to illustrate the many ways in which men and boys are discriminated against. If we are to factor in the inescapability of culture, in real terms, as it relates to Benatar's broader set of beliefs, it must be pointed out that he is a white man, in South Africa, who supports the Zionist project and considers the Arab population in Israel to be morally problematic. That he is a white man in South Africa who considers identity politics and wokeness as a problematic point of capitulation within Western academia. That he is a white man in South Africa who considers the problems facing men and boys, in particular, as social inequities worthy of a book with a title that is a brazen reply to the seminal feminist work The Second Sex by de Beauvoir. That such discrete values emerge from a mind that considers human life to be at least less valuable than human suffering should not be a surprise. It is only by respecting culture for what it is that we can escape meaninglessness, for we are not Sisyphus pushing the rock, we are Sisyphus in the land of the living, with the option to be hospitable or not. It is only by respecting discrete modes of meaning-making as valuable that we can use them to identify modes of transcendent meaning for ourselves, for we are not in a cold and indifferent universe, rather, we are in an ambiguous one. The alternative to embracing these arbitrary sacrednesses? It is to see humans as things, mere vessels for suffering or for joy. And if a human is a mere vessel for suffering, then there really is no difference between the absence of the suffering and the absence of the vessel. So ask yourself, hold your self-image in your mind and ask, are you a mere vessel? If there is any ambiguity, you must act as if you are not a vessel, because if you are not, then neither is anyone else, and that means that they need you.
Oh, it's better never to have been. Oh, it's better never to have been. It is better never to have been. And you'll be happy when you don't exist. Happy. You'll be happy when you don't exist. Because then you won't exist. And you'll be happy as can be. For it's better never to have